They can actually trace things being added and removed. The edge was perforated like it was sewn into clothing before it was buried. Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are finishing up The Other Ancient Civilisations by Raven Todd da Silva, also known as Dig It with Raven. We're looking forward to talking about this and wrapping up with the final 5 civilizations covered in the book. But before we get to that, today we have a comment to read. On our Portraits and Pyramids, our previous episode, Witchcraft commented, "Had no idea FPAN had a YouTube channel. I'm in."
Yay.
We're super excited to have you. We love talking about archaeology and the past, and if you want to help us reach more people, give us a like, subscribe, comment, review, whatever's appropriate on your platform. If you want to help us even further, you will find a donation link in the description as well.
And if we have one new listener, we can have more, so please share as well with your friends who you think might be interested.
All right, straight into our first chapter for this episode is all about the Olmec.
Which I feel like is a culture that a lot of people may at least have heard of, but maybe haven't really ever taken a deep dive.
Yeah, I think it's something that gets thrown out there because, as the chapter even talks about, they're, until very recently, pretty mysterious culture.
Yeah.
Like, a lot much was known about them for good reasons. So, like, we need someone who sounds mysterious, we'll say Olmec.
Right.
And that is actually, case in study is National Treasure 2, the second one.
I don't know if I ever saw the second one.
It's one of the most ridiculous things I've seen in a movie. It turns out, the spoilers, if anyone hasn't seen that probably 15 to 20-year-old movie, it turns out that the U.S. presidents built Mount Rushmore to hide an Olmec site.
What? Okay.
Which was one of the more ridiculous things I've heard in a movie. It was really funny.
I'm surprised that hasn't become like a weird conspiracy on the archaeology Reddit threads.
It almost sounds like it was based on something too, doesn't it?
Yes.
So who knows? Maybe it actually exists, but it made me laugh a lot when I saw that movie.
Oh boy, now I have to watch it. Thanks, Tristan.
Yeah. Also, actually, as you mentioned, it's something that it's a name that's mentioned but not talked about very often. Case and Study is our podcast so far.
Yeah.
We have actually talked or mentioned the name of Olmec culture in 4 other books.
4, really?
Yep.
Oh, huh.
And none of them had all that much in the way of substance. It was just like maybe this started, like maybe, I think maybe like chocolate might have started with the Olmec. Or
oh, yeah.
The 9 Lives of Florida's famous Key Marco cat, there was a guess that maybe Olmec art may have influenced the cat, which I can see now having read this chapter.
Yeah.
So we've definitely talked about it a bunch, but we've not gone into any real detail about it. So it's fun to actually kind of get some substance on the Olmec now.
One of the things I like that this author does really well is explain that a lot of times what we refer to cultures as, like the names we give them, are not necessarily what they called themselves. And in this case, I guess it was the Aztec that referred to this area as Olmen, which means land of rubber, and referred to the people as Olmeca. So I just think it's really interesting that she points that out, because I feel like that's something you and I have to explain to a lot of people when we talk to them.
Right. Well, the fact that it came from another indigenous
culture
group is actually unusual. Well, not fully.
But it's just interesting because usually it's like European explorers that give them a name, or they like change up a name that they were using and make it very European sounding, or, it's just, this is a little bit different, I feel like.
Yes, agreed.
But we don't know what they called themselves.
The Olmec are most well known for the giant stone heads that they carved out of basalt, I think mostly, if I recall.
Yeah.
They did use a lot of green stone for other things, but mostly the heads were out of basalt, which they had to transport quite a long ways to make that happen, too. And so most of what we know about the Olmec is through their cities.
It sounds like they were quite the engineers.
Yes.
even having like a drainage system, which I'm surprised in this book how much plumbing we're learning about.
Right.
I always thought it was this like rare thing because it's something that I remember in history class, if a civilization had plumbing or had, some type of drainage system, it was always mentioned. But reading this book, I'm like, I think there's more than we initially think as far as people that had drainage systems, which makes sense because it rains and, people just don't like being wet.
Right. And nobody likes human waste and other things too. They like that to kind of be gone, even though I know in the past people were much more used to it than we are now. But yeah, the drainage was interesting because it wasn't just like, a ditch or something. They carved basalt into U-shaped and then had a cover to fit over it.
Yeah, it was essentially like almost like a pipe, kind of.
Yeah, it wasn't a small endeavor, though.
Right.
In the site La Venta, they did have a large pyramid in the middle of this city, which sounds very cool, very technologically advanced as far as people think of earthen mounds as just a pile of dirt. But really, if people are building these, there is engineering involved in that, in what kinds of dirts to apply and what orders and that kind of a thing. I did like a quote from the author here at the end when the city is eventually abandoned. Even though it no longer functioned as a city or ritual center, the importance of the site appears to have never been lost to the people who inhabited the area. The ruins of La Venta still receive pottery offerings a few hundred years after its abandonment, and a purposely buried olive jar from the early colonial period of Mesoamerica has also been found.
This whole segment made me think of Lost City of the Monkey Gods and how wrong they got it in that book.
Right. The whole Lost City concept is just so wrong already. Because here, once again, the author is going out of her way to say this was not lost.
Right.
People knew it was there. It was important to people. And the same thing is true with the so-called the City of the Monkey God.
Yeah.
Or City of the Jaguar.
Right.
That was never lost. People knew it was there. And we picked up on that as we were actually reading that book. Like, there's a village like 20 miles away or something. It's like, they know it's there?
Right. Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And this is a far cry from that book,
very much so.
So much
very
more
much so.
well thought out and deliberate in what it says and how it is said compared to Lost City. And I also noticed she mentions about how they were avid chocolate drinkers. And of course, we talked about that as well, like you mentioned in previous books.
Yes. She says this was the first area to use chocolate, but as Ancient Brews talked about or mentioned at one point, who is the first isn't really the most important question.
Right.
But if we're talking about the Olmec in this context and they were the first to use it, then that's a little more important to mention.
Yeah, and just like in Ancient Brews, they did analysis on the interior of ceramics to get the chemical compounds from cacao to figure out that they were drinking it, and they ate them and drank them.
Right.
Which I wonder I feel like a cacao seed's going to be really, really bitter.
Right. And there's quite a large section here talking about the stone carving. So there's lots of different kinds of stone carving. Of course, the heads are the most well known. But I wanted to take a moment to highlight something the author here says is with the heads and the size they were, we don't really know how they transported them. But I want to really emphasize, tying back to yet another book we've talked about before, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, just because we don't know doesn't mean aliens.
Right.
Just because we don't have a definitive answer right now does not mean aliens should be our default thing we go to. We have some ideas on how they might have done it. It's just we don't know the exact method that they used.
Yes. And therein lies, honestly, the strength of science, right? The way that we or other scientists extrapolated those different methods is what is scientifically possible. And it does seem that it is indeed scientifically possible, thus not aliens.
Right. Well, it's not to say that it can't ever be aliens, but just because we can't explain something doesn't mean that it is aliens. That's the important distinction here, I think.
Yeah, okay. I guess that's fair. And I like how in this chapter when she starts talking about the decline of the Olmec, just to kind of wrap things up, she states like it did not simply just disappear. And again, it seems like there were a variety of factors, environmental and otherwise, that caused the kind of decline. But she even states that it evolved and changed, and their descendants, drew upon symbols and iconographies and adapted them into, different traditions.
Right.
Which I think is really, really important to point out, because so many people, again, use terminology like lost or disappeared or, the end, like it's finite, and it's not.
Yeah. And so the Olmec started around 1800 BCE and kind of finally disappeared 400 to 200 BCE, depending on how you kind of look at it. Like Barbara said, it was kind of a gradual
And it's important
change.
to point out that this was the culture that invented things like the long count calendar, which was used by the Mayans, and the ball game, and the ritual use of rubber, and other things that other Mesoamerican cultures took on as traditions as well.
Next up, we've got the Scythians. I think the rest of the cultures we talk about today, I don't know anything about them. Like Olmec is something I've heard about, but the rest of them I'm entirely unfamiliar with. The Scythians were a nomadic people that on the Eurasian steppe, and where they came from exactly, we don't really know, right?
Correct.
We have some ideas, but nothing real definitive.
And it seems like the word Scythians is a collective name for multiple nomadic tribes. And I think we see that in a couple of the cultures in this book, where it's kind of a collective name for various groups of people that kind of exist in a similar fashion or under one similar ruler, or, within a political system together.
Right. There's a difference between a culture and a kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
And most of what we're talking about here are cultures rather than kingdoms, because sometimes I think they also aren't as easily divided into those categories. So we're talking about groups of people, or we don't know actually how they were organized in full detail.
And of course, I think it's cool that because they were nomadic, they didn't have really intensive agriculture, and they kind of became a horse-centric pastoral group of people. And obviously, being a horse girl, that's when my interest peaked.
Yeah. So they appeared about 750 BCE and are responsible for a fair number of horse-related inventions of the era.
I thought it was interesting because I guess they use wagons. There isn't really a lot of archaeological evidence for actual wagons, but they found little clay model wagons in some of the burials, which I thought that was just a neat way to figure out what their wagons may have looked like. You don't have the actual thing, but you have models of it.
Yeah. You want to talk about their horse tack inventions?
Oh, well, do I want to talk about their horse tack inventions? Of course. I will say, to me, as an equestrian, the biggest invention that I am thankful for is the saddle. That, to me, is such a huge invention. Revolutionary, At this point, they didn't have stirrups, though. So in my mind, I kind of think of it as like a bareback pad.
Because they said it was soft, right?
Yeah, they soft, and seems like it was very comfortable for probably both the person riding and the horse. I know they had double curved composite bows, which I have seen videos of even people today horseback riding and using bows. There's a equestrian modern day competition for that. And it's just the level of horsemanship I think you would have to be accurate on a bow or with a bow while on horseback is pretty impressive. So these were quite the horsemen and horsewomen, maybe. I don't know if we have any horse people. We'll say horse people.
Horse people. Yeah. One thing I liked about the bows is this is something we see in wood scarce cultures sometimes, is the bows actually had no wood. It was all bone and sinew.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, these are extremely flexible bows typically, and they are also can be very temperamental and hard to care for because different temperatures, different humidities can sometimes throw them off and make them problematic.
And it sounds like they had I'm not going to be able to pronounce it, but it's a piece of equipment that would hold both the bow and arrows, and it hung on their left hip. I ride and compete in dressage, which has its roots in military, and people often ask me, like, why do you always mount a horse from the left side? And it's because throughout history, weapons almost always hung off your left side so that you could grab them with your right hand. And so you would have them kind of dangling down around your hip, which makes it really hard for you to get your leg up over the horse. So you would always put the leg that didn't have all that stuff hanging off of it over the horse. And that's why we mount from that side. And in dressage, we actually salute with our right hand because it would have been the hand you used to grab your weapons. It would have been free. So I thought that was pretty cool. A little cool connection there.
I also liked that they could see a difference in how horses were cared for based on their hoof prints.
Yeah. And how like the ones that were used for battle were
had a little extra care or something going on.
than those that were kind of used to haul the wagons and stuff like that.
I also found I'm not going to try and say this, but they had a fermented, mildly alcoholic mare's milk that was a staple for them.
I just want to know who was responsible for milking the mares because mares can be sassy. But I guess it's something that was drank in other cultures as well.
Right. Well, and I'm interested on, apparently it's super good for you. Like, good for your nervous system, good for blood formation, acid reflux, and lots of vitamins. So nutritionally, it was like super important for this culture because they're pastoral, so they relied heavily on meat.
Yeah.
And so they needed these other sources of vitamins and such.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting how that always seems to work out, or almost always seems to work out, how different cultures figure out how to find that balance in different ways depending upon their kind of way of life.
Yeah. And then we get a description on what we understand of the blood brother ritual.
Yeah.
Which we see versions of this in modern media today, even sometimes. And I wonder if some of this started here or if this has influenced later European cultures. I'm kind of curious on the history of this kind of ritual here. This was something between two warriors. They would mix their blood in wine, dip their weapons in it, and then drink it with other rituals and stuff going on too. And this was like a deep declaration of loyalty and friendship to each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I know this is one of those things by today's standards, people might be like, ew, gross, or what have you. But you have to, again, take it within the context of the time and look at the meaning behind it. There's nothing. And we find that in a lot of cultures, blood is really considered sacred, right? And in a lot of, religious contexts as well.
Yeah, so I'm curious if those things, maybe they appear spontaneously or if they originate with one group or a few groups or how that kind of develops. But yeah, they were very focused on blood and killing people, a lot of very warrior focused.
And I noticed that they had tattoos. And a lot of times they would tattoo like animal iconography and things onto themselves, which goes to show, how much they relied on these animals and what they meant to them, because nothing more permanent than a tattoo.
Yeah. Okay. And then by the 4th century BCE, their power was declining. And we don't know, again, like with many of these, we don't know exactly why. We see lots of fighting with other tribes in Mesoamerica. We also have indications that perhaps new groups of nomads were moving into the area. So again, the indication is not that they went extinct. It's just that they changed into something else probably and influenced other groups. Does that cover it?
Yep.
They really strike me as, I wasn't sure how to express this. They strike me as kind of when you read fantasy, especially like pulp fantasy of like dark rituals and barbarians and their violence. Like, it kind of sounds like these guys, like making cups out of the skulls of your enemies because it gives you power.
Yeah.
Like, that really, it feels like they kind of earned that reputation there.
Yeah. Yeah. They're just very interesting and cool. I don't know. I'd never really, I guess, read about a culture that combined all these different elements, I guess.
Yeah. For chapter 18, we are going to be talking about the Thule.
I think it's the Thule.
Thule. Okay, thank you.
I had to look that up.
That's good. I won't read that like an English speaker anymore then. So the Thule are early Inuit or precursors to what we call Inuit today.
But again, this is a situation where the name was given to them by someone else. In this case, it's Danish. Surprise, a European explorer named this group of people.
So we are looking at, they kind of developed or become distinct around 1 1000 CE, and then they spread east at a remarkable rate. A lot of the chapter here is dedicated to trying to figure out why would they do that, right? Because they're doing it so fast that they can't always know where they're going, like the terrain and such ahead of them. Whereas a lot of groups will spread and they'll a couple of generations, they get to know the area and they get to know what's over there, and then it's like, well, then they want to move for a reason.
Right, yeah.
So something was driving this, and the best answer I think we got from this chapter, at least, is it's complicated.
Right.
Because humans are complicated,
Yes.
and there's often multiple reasons for a thing to happen. It's kind of what it comes down to. So maybe warfare, maybe economic pressures, maybe lower classes looking for change. Maybe the drive was to seek metal because they did not have permanent settlements. They weren't able to set up permanent forges and such for themselves, and the Danes were a good source of trade for metal.
Yeah.
And so, but that doesn't explain why they went all the way to Greenland. They couldn't have known from the Alaska area or Bering Strait area to Greenland that there would be metal to trade there. We don't think. So it's complicated. We don't exactly know why.
And it seems like around this time, too, the Norse were in Greenland, and the Thule Inuit eventually, it seems, based on archaeological evidence as well as oral tradition, that those two coexisted for some time as well.
Yes. It seems likely. Like, our evidence on that is sparse, but it seems very likely that they did, I think, is what I understood.
Yeah.
Their lifestyle actually is very interesting, I found. Warmer seasons, they would move inland and they'd hunt caribou and fish. Colder seasons, they'd be on the coast hunting seal and I think whale.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting, too. Their adaptations for their houses was different. And, they had like a winter house and a summer house, essentially, or a warm weather house and a cold weather house. And the engineering and the thought, and especially the cold weather house, how they had kind of an air trap to keep them warm and keep the warm air in and things like that was pretty genius.
Yeah. So the winter houses, again, I liked them too. They were partially underground and they would have a roof with, I think, typically seal skin or caribou skin and a rigging of wood or whalebone.
Yeah.
And then they would have a long, small entrance that you'd have to crawl through for, retaining heat, basically. So a very clever adaptation, essentially, in a very harsh environment.
And also, they were hunting whale, which, holy moly, I can't even imagine doing that today. But they had different types of watercraft I don't know how to say it, Tristan, but they had one craft that was specifically, it was larger so that it could fit more people for hunting whale.
And transportation, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could transport goods. Yeah.
Here's one thing from the book. I thought this has to be an error. It says in spring they would resume hunting for small mammals such as muskox and hare. Muskox is not a small mammal.
Oh, yeah. I guess
so,
in relation to a whale? I don't know.
That's kind of what is that what we're saying? But in relation to everything else they're hunting, that's got to be about the biggest thing, I would think.
Yeah, I didn't catch that, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so I was a little confused by that. I feel like that's got to be just a typo, but...
Yeah, we'll go with a typo.
I was very confused by that for a moment. I had to read it several times. Lots of different hunting tools. Hunting was such an important thing, and so they had specialized hunting tools for all kinds of different types of hunting and animals they were hunting.
Yeah, she referred to them as the most gadget-oriented people in prehistory.
Right.
Which I thought was a kind of an interesting way to put that.
Yep. And then by the 1500s, this version of the Thule Inuit kind of started to wane. And again, we're not exactly sure why. So the original thought was that they had started to decline in the 1500s, and that could be related to the little ice age that kind of caused a mini ice age around the world, and that just caused the climate to become too harsh. But in reality, more recently, we have found that the decline started in the 1300s. So we don't know exactly why, but it is another case of they didn't just disappear. They shifted and merged with other groups, and so they are really not gone. They just, what we recognize in the archaeological record is no longer present.
There were a couple, like, how we were talking about how they were gadget oriented.
Yeah.
I just want to point out two different things. Number one, this is another instance of where their bows were not made from wood or they were sometimes made from wood, but they were also made from baleen, from the bowhead whale.
And sinew.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which I was like, wait, how long can baleen be? And it can be like over a meter long, which I had no idea.
And if you're dealing with compound bows, it doesn't have to be all one piece. There are methods of splicing wood and such together that various cultures used, even if they had wood.
And they also had like goggles that they made for to protect their eyes from the glare, because they're living in an environment where it's all reflective essentially, and so it's really harsh on your eyes with all the snow and ice. And I was like, well, I was trying to think like, what kind of goggles would these be? And then I saw pictures of them and I was like, oh yeah, I have seen those before, and it's just essentially like a piece of leather or other material with a slit through them.
Yeah. I've seen them in survival movies or something before. Yeah.
So that was really cool too. So they had some cool gizmos and gadgets.
Yeah.
Very adaptive.
All right. For our chapter 19, we are going to talk about a group of people that I'm not going to dare try and pronounce. Barbara, have you looked it up?
I looked it up, and it's funny because my Kindle wouldn't translate it. So I went to YouTube, and it's Únětice.
Okay, so this is a group of people in Central Europe, and they started around 2200 BCE. And this is, we keep saying it, as I said last episode too, this very interesting culture. This is actually, as far as we can tell, a merging of two cultures to create, almost intentionally to create a new culture.
Yeah.
So we have the corded ware culture and the bell breaker culture, which came from different areas and seemed to converge in this spot, and then very intentional merging of the two cultures. One of the examples of how intentional this is in what's called the princely tombs, which these are burials of, they think, high-status individuals. The burial is a wooden tent-like burial chamber with lots of weaponry, which is a very corded ware culture symbol. But the weapons themselves and the eastward orientation of the burial are very bell breaker culture. So it seems very intentional, like we're going to do these things, you're going to do these things, we're going to do these together.
I do a lot with historic cemeteries, and I always get this question, like when I'm giving tours, if Christians were the only people that buried their dead facing east, and no. This is a good example of that.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to point that out.
And Christians didn't always bury their dead facing east either.
Right.
Importantly.
Yes.
People are complicated.
Right.
One thing that struck me with this chapter, actually, I had a couple issues with this chapter that I felt unusual for the rest of them. It mentions that one tomb was found with a stone axe, and the stone axe was thought to be used to provide historical status to the person's position. Like, basically, this is, we've been doing this so long, this is the ancient weapon that's been passed down to me. And I really would need to see more evidence. Maybe that exists and it just wasn't talked about in the book, but it felt weird to mention something like that without saying why we think that.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. And yeah, I will say I didn't take the time to look through all of her references. So it might be there. So I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt on that because it seems well researched.
She seems to be very reliable. I just kind of I really want to know why we think that almost. It's something that was missing to me because it could be as fascinating as we know that nobody made stone tools like this. And clearly they made it in this time period to be used for some purpose like this or something.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know more. That's kind of one of the reasons it struck me. There's some confusion about how warrior focused they were, because all the weapons in the princely burials suggest they were very warrior focused, but they didn't have fortified hilltops, and the common burials didn't include weapons. So it's unclear on how much they used, but the weapons that were buried in the princely burials had been utilized. We can see that in wear patterns and such. And
I think they found some burials that had evidence of trauma too.
Yes.
So
it seems some indication of some level of warfare. It's unclear how much of that is. Well, again, this was actually another thing that struck me, because of like some large-scale grinding stones with some of the princely burials. We think that grain was super important and they were producing on a very large scale. And because they needed it on a large scale, that probably means they had a standing army.
Yeah.
And it felt, again, it didn't feel like a strong connection with the information given here.
That stuck out to me as well. And the way she made it seem was like that was like a common thing, which I can see, but as far as making that as an assumption, I would need to see evidence to see if that was like a common
the
situation.
Reasoning makes sense to me, but that doesn't necessarily convince me.
Right. Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
That's the situation.
Yeah.
Yet another issue. So this is something that was kind of cool about this group is they were very good metal workers, and bronze specifically. They had basically all the resources they needed in their territory to produce bronze, and no one else in Europe in this area really did. So they kind of had monopoly on it. And actually they were using bronze tools when the neighbors were often still using copper or stone. Here's a sentence, though, that I could not figure out. I read it multiple times. It's used as evidence, I think, for the cultural influence of their work and of their metalwork. Eyelet pins made of bone and flint daggers with fake casting seams to make them look more like metal ones have been found in Scandinavia.
I think she was, I don't know what all that means, but the gist I got from it was that they were such great metal workers that people were trying to imitate their work.
Or they were trying to imitate, metal work. These metal things are cool. They have these seams. These seams are now stylish to have on other things too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's how I understood it. But the eyelet pins made of bone and flint daggers doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And I could not figure that out. But
I don't know if daggers means something else in like
or does it
common
mean
British
with
terms?
Bone and flint daggers?
I don't know.
Or did they carve these pins from the daggers? How do we know they're carved? So there's too many questions in that first part, but that's not important, I guess, to the overall understanding of the idea here. I got stuck on that for a while. And so because of their metalwork and their location, this is a little similar to the Nabateans that we talked about last time, it seems like, where a lot of their growth and influence is based on their location and importance for trade. And ultimately, probably one of the things that caused their ultimate decline was this reliance on trade because the trade patterns shifted on them.
And I think I had not heard of this specific artifact before, but I feel like it's one that people may have heard of before, so I want to mention it, is the Nebra sky disk. I guess a lot of cultures do this for various reasons, but it could be like religious based or navigation based, or, elements of the sky show up in their religion or their belief system somehow. And I guess the Nebra sky disk is very accurate, which is interesting.
Yeah, they think it was used to synchronize the solar and lunar years.
Yeah. And like
initially.
Yeah, like super, super accurate. Yeah. And then it kind of evolved into more of a symbolic artifact.
Yeah, or the meaning and the usefulness of it was lost over time. It seems like they can actually trace things being added and removed from it, and then the edge was perforated like it was like sewn into clothing at one point towards what she was thinking was the end of its cycle before it was buried.
Yeah, it became more of like just a religious symbol or something rather than something that was being used.
I was a little unclear. Another sentence that struck me and I had to read several times about this object: the simplicity and utilitarian design of the disc suggests that the astronomical knowledge needed to accurately use the Nebra sky disk would have been restricted to only a few people. Why does its simplicity and utilitarian design mean it was restricted to just a few people? I didn't understand that.
I don't know how they would know that. I would be curious to know how they knew that its use was restricted. Is it just because they've only found one?
It doesn't say that though, right?
Yeah.
And being simple and utilitarian would suggest it's a more common item to me, less of a elite item.
Yeah, I had personally not heard of this artifact before, which kind of surprised me because a lot of times if there's like an artifact that is associated with a culture, even if I haven't heard of the culture, a lot of times the name of the artifact will ring a bell.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not the case with this one. So I'm not super familiar with it. So I can't even really use any contextual information from any other sources.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure what's going on with this chapter for me, but for some reason, I just hit more sentences of like, I don't understand what this is trying to say here. This has not been typical for the whole book.
Right, and I wonder if it's a case of just there's a lot of information about this culture, and maybe it's taught about in England, and because I mean she's in, and it's more of a common culture for them to know about.
Well, that would not be the point of the book.
No,
either.
but you know, like they may have at least heard of them before. Like we've heard some of these cultures.
So she's relying on some knowledge of her audience, perhaps.
Yeah, but I thought it was cool too that this group understood hemispheres long before the ancient Greeks did.
And cyclical time.
Yeah, so you know, you're always taught like the Greeks came up with all this stuff. And it's like, well, actually, it was probably built on.
Lots of groups came up with stuff.
Yeah. And a lot of what the Greeks knew came from somewhere.
Yep. And so like I mentioned, eventually they started to decline around 1600 BCE. Possible shifting trade environment, the usual suspects. Also part of it could be that bronze was a lot of their power, and at this point bronze was no longer as rare as it had been.
Right.
Our final culture for this book and this episode.
And I'm leaving this pronunciation up to you, Tristan.
This is the Xiongnu.
Okay, I'll let you say that.
Xiongnu is a Chinese name given to a group of people. These are, again, nomads on the steppes instead of just
back on the Eurasian steppes.
Yep, just on the eastern version instead of the western version this time. And this has some similarities almost with the Nubians, right? Is that Egypt? In that it seems like what is thought of as the dominant culture and this culture had a lot of interacting and a lot of warfare constantly. They're constantly like relying on each other and getting things from each other and then fighting each other. And so the Xiongnu had a lot of influence, it seems like, over China and vice versa, of course.
Yeah, this was really interesting to me because I did my field school in China and it was actually on a Han Dynasty site. And so that plays into this culture as well.
Wait, didn't we think you were in the Xi'an Palace?
Yeah.
Is that we decided?
Yeah.
Which I have also seen since you've been there. So Xi'an at this time period was the capital of China. And it was also the start of the Silk Road eventually. When the Xiongnu start, the Silk Road is not yet in existence, but it does come around.
Right.
They kind of start to show up around the 3rd century BCE. We don't know exactly where they came from, but we have some genetic research that suggests who their previous ancestors were. Everything we've written about them is from China, court documents and such.
Right, which I like how she discusses how that can be problematic.
It's problematic no matter the time period.
Right,
too.
yeah.
This is one of the weaknesses of historic records, especially when they're talking about someone else. We're not getting the people's perspective who they're talking about. We're getting that person's perspective of who they're talking about.
And that can be clouded with so many things.
Well, they're coming in with their own cultural biases.
Yeah.
They're coming in. Sometimes they do not get along with these groups. All kinds of different things.
Yep.
But yeah, we get a little bit of the, I still find very confusing Chinese dynasty history.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I won't go into that too much here.
But she does a good job of navigating it where I didn't feel like I was getting bogged down at least.
She does as good as anyone could expect.
And I think it's important to note too that this is a group or a culture made up of multiple groups of people.
Yep.
And she goes into like how they were kind of divided and, their kinship groups and things like that, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Well, and it's interesting too that they had a kind of a nomadic empire.
Yeah.
Not as nomadic as you would get from the Chinese records, importantly. The Chinese records say they never lived in one place.
Right.
They always did, these things. And in reality,
they had...
Of course not.
Right. Yeah. They had, there's archaeological evidence that shows that they had settlements and things like that.
Yeah. And a little like the Nubians in this case too, because as the empire matured, I suppose, it actually started to establish more and more permanent settlements and things.
Which, if you take into consideration what was going on between between them and China, that makes sense.
Yep.
That kind of fits the narrative.
And they also intentionally conquered and controlled territories of groups that were agricultural because they relied on the agriculture.
Yeah.
They relied on a lot of stuff from China for agriculture, basically, and whenever they were in conflict, then they needed other sources of that kind of a thing.
And I thought the narrative at the beginning, because these were also another group that was highly reliant upon horses, and I liked the narrative at the beginning. It was about a child riding a sheep, essentially learning how to become a horse person by riding a sheep instead of a horse. One thing that stuck out to me was like, oh, wow, this was a child. And then, you know, she had other narratives where there were women. And I think she does a really good job creating more of a diverse narrative, because I think I always tell people that's one of the strengths of archaeology, as you can tell, you know, the written record in this case is probably a highly male focused, warrior focused, and obviously from the Chinese perspective. And so learning about how the children and the women lived and stuff is one of the strengths of archaeology. And I think she does a really good job of kind of hinting at that.
Yeah, and there is some evidence that women may have been quite powerful in this culture sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, they had a very powerful military. They had a specific leader who shifted it from heavily armed cavalry to light archer-focused cavalry. And they were, I guess, a big problem to China, to the point where they pushed them back multiple times. Ultimately, kind of the end of the culture-ish was they pushed them out entirely and incorporated some of the groups into China itself and that kind of a thing. So,
well, and they talk about the Great Wall.
Yep.
This was around the time when they started to take that tactic, I guess, because the Great Wall isn't just one wall.
It's not.
Yeah. And it was built through a variety of periods and conflicts. So this was kind of, I guess you could say, the start of that.
They started it partly for this group, because of this group.
Yeah.
Importantly, too, is apparently the Xiongnu repeatedly invaded or raided China despite the wall.
Yeah.
It didn't really... I'd be interested to see how much of effect it actually had. Did it actually curtail things, or did they just kind of like, we're just going to ride around it, you know?
Right. Yeah.
We finish off the chapter with some question, are they related to the Huns? And basically we think it's unlikely, although we certainly do see some Mongol connections with this group.
Right. Which, as I was reading this, the whole time I was like, oh my gosh, are these like the precursor to the Mongols, you know?
Right.
And I guess, although not definitive, it's possibly likely.
Or, like other cultures, this culture faded and merged into other cultures that eventually, so the Mongols have some ancestry, cultural ancestry with them at least.
But it seems like a really cool culture. And I also, you know, we were talking about women earlier and how they were important. Seems like the women were also very effective what's the word for someone who's...
Horse archers?
Horse archers. There you go. That works. They were known to protect the children and the elderly from enemies and things. So I thought it was really cool.
Yeah. That's just kind of where the book ends.
Yeah.
I
thought there was going to be a wrap up.
I thought it'd be a wrap up.
Yeah.
It was also an odd last section, because it's like, it feels like if the last thing you have is, are they related to the Huns, that's somehow supposed to be like the whole point of the book.
Yeah.
Right? Because what's the point of the conclusion? But obviously that was not at all what it was. It was hardly even a conclusion for the chapter, I felt like.
Well, and I thought there was going to be a wrap up because, you know, at the beginning she talked about how, you know, these were lesser known cultures, but they were just as important. And as we have now read, a lot of the things that we know about these more popular cultures in some way were influenced by these lesser known cultures. And so I thought there would be some like grand
I mean,
moment.
I can give a little bit of a grand idea here, is that even if you are, for example, very into Egypt and only into Egypt, if you want to fully understand Egypt, you have to understand the cultures that they were interacting with as well.
Right, yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
that's kind of that. And so basically, to our listeners, if you are into any of these well-known cultures, I think there's a very good case in this book for why you want to actually start to kind of get to know the other cultures that they interacted with as well.
Yeah, you'll have a much more thorough understanding. And I think it's interesting too, because we always think of like how, oh, well, now we live in a globalized society and obviously on very different levels. But I think thinking that way tends to make people assume that past cultures kind of lived in isolation and never really interacted with each other and didn't have a ton of influence on each other. And I think this book goes to show that, again, on different levels, but we've always interacted with other people and we've always been influenced by them culturally.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a trend when talking about one of these influential cultures, Rome, Egypt, Babylon, China, to take it as though all culture flowed from these places. Whereas reality is that they were just as influenced by their neighboring cultures as they influenced those cultures. And yeah, I mean, how do you understand Egypt and not understand the Nabaeans? Anyway, did you have something else to add?
No,
Okay.
I think this book fills a niche that I think I would love to see more books like this.
Really would, yeah.
Yeah, because this is the first book of this type that I've ever really come across. And I think I love that the author wrote it. And I would love to see more like it. But I
Right.
really enjoyed it. What did you think?
I think it was pretty excellent. We had some very minor critiques, but they're very minor. Here's a question. Who would you recommend this for, Barbara?
Ooh. Honestly, I would recommend this for people who, the first thing that comes to mind are people that are like obsessed with Egypt.
Mhm.
I know a lot of folks, when they think of archaeology, Egypt is the first thing that comes to mind, or like the Mayan or Aztec. And I think I would recommend it to people who, when I'm saying, oh yeah, I'm an archaeologist, they're like, oh my gosh, like Egypt or, Mesoamerica. And I'd be like, well, actually, there's other cultures,
Yeah.
So I think it's good for folks that already kind of have an interest in those bigger cultures, and this helps them broaden their perspective.
I think this would be a good book for about anybody.
Yeah.
I think one of the major values of this book is some of these cultures you hear about, but you don't know anything about them.
Right.
And so this gives you context for, oh yeah, the Assyrians, oh yeah, the Olmec. Gives you some context for when you do hear about them. But also I think, kind of like what you're saying, anyone who's like super into history of these ancient cultures and stuff, this is an excellent opportunity to broaden your understanding of these ancient worlds and what it was like. So I think that is a pretty easy recommendation from us all around.
Agreed.
Yeah, definitely recommend this book. Give it a read. There's, of course, lots of details that we didn't talk about. So if any of this caught your fancy, definitely check it out. Highly recommend.
And it's an easy read. It really is an easy, kind of quick read.
Yeah, it's impressive to me how, it can be very complicated to try and talk about some of these things in a short period. And she navigated that very, very well.
Yes.
Better than some of the other books. Even the books we've liked sometimes tended to be just kind of a list of things or something, and this book avoids that very neatly, I'd say.
Agreed.
I think that wraps us up for this episode and this book. For next episode, will be January 1st, and we will actually be doing something a little different. We're going to take a break from reading because we don't have time, and we're going to talk about some of the upcoming projects and stuff we're looking forward to. Then we will continue with a new book the episode after that. Until then, we'll see y'all next time.
All right. Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.